My name is Seraphina, the Masked Lady. I was once human. Since then, I have lived many lives. I have been loved and reviled, adored and despised, been the child of a poor prostitute and a courtesan revered by thousands. When I was a child, a stranger with no face offered me the ability to move between the worlds. Since then, my every death has led to a new life. I once had a true love. He was ripped away from me when I was murdered in the 18th century. I search for him still. In the meantime, I walk in the shadows behind the universe, visiting realms both exquisite and terrible and bringing back stories and rhymes to amaze the mind and enchant the ear. Through my YouTube channel, I send the stories out into the world, hoping that my true love will hear them and reply. Hoping, if he does not, that I will find in the other souls who listen kindred spirits to help ease the pain. What of you, stranger? Did you come here tonight seeking a mystery? Do you hunger for a spark of excitement, for the dark thrill of fear? Will you listen as my tales unfold, knowing that some may very well take on lives of their own? Consider, stranger, whether you have the courage to walk between the worlds with Seraphina, the Masked Lady. Good evening, my darlings, and a very warm hello to you. It's May, and I am delighted to enjoy summer's first warm flush. I spent this month in our own dimension working on a stall at a charity fete. The proceeds from the event went towards building an orphanage overseas. No, we didn't quite manage to fund an entire orphanage alone, but our efforts got them part of the way there, and that matters. A friend once told me that people avoid giving for fear that their kindness will be thought too small. He also told me that if 1 million people were to donate a penny to charity, then that charity would receive in total £10,000. A not insubstantial sum, and surely enough to do a lot of good with. His conclusion was this: that no kindness is ever too small to be worth doing. I thought about that when I found tonight's story. The writer of this tale lives in a part of the world that, in this dimension, you would call Spain. It is one of her first published works, and she has kindly granted me permission to share it with you. I hope you enjoy it! The Bruja. Chapter 1. Marianna stepped out of her house and closed the door behind her, pausing a moment to take a deep breath of the night air. The warm breeze that flirted with the strands of her hair was scented with jasmine. The odor made her smile. Marianna's house lay beyond the fields, just past the outskirts of the city. The stench and rot of the slums did not reach this far. The air around her home was clear. Marianna found the rhythm of the countryside familiar and comforting. Living things squeaked, ran, and scuttled through the nearby crops, and the leathery wings of bats beat the air as they hunted for insects. In the distance, a night bird let out a low wail. Sadly, Marianna only had one moment to enjoy the beauty of the evening. She had a mission, and it could not be delayed. By hurrying, Marianna reached the city wall in 20 minutes. The scene at the main gate could not have differed more from the pleasant vista surrounding her home. The gates themselves had long ago been broken. They hung, rotting, on their hinges, useless for welcome or defense. The road between them was pitted with hoof prints and ruts left by the wheels of carts. Those who traveled by carriage would be fortunate not to throw a wheel, while a person on foot was in grave danger of a turned ankle. Marianna was used to the journey. She skirted the edge of the track, crossing the bridge that traversed the shallow moat and passing into the shadowy place beneath the archway. The smell that met her as she moved across the bridge was noxious, the odor of human feces strong enough to steal Marianna's breath. She tried not to glance at the cracked pipes that disgorged the foulness of the sewers into the shallow trench. To one not prepared, the stench might have been enough to make them swoon. Even Marianna had to lift her cloak to cover her nose. Marianna picked up her pace as she entered the darkness between the arches. Furtive eyes gleamed at her from the shadows. Men with low brows and swarthy faces huddled together, whispering. Here and there, a pipe or cigarette flared crimson. Marianna was aware of her eyes narrowing as the men's faces swung towards her. A ripple of murmurs filled the night. Somebody spat the word, Bruja. Marianna winced. It didn't matter how long her family had lived in the community or how many lives and children they saved. They were only ever viewed with malice and distrust.
Cutie Jordan Bruja,
a voice cried out. Yeah, Marianna thought. Fuck you too. A stone soared out of the night, narrowly missing her. Moments later, a little boy darted past her, giggling. Before Marianna could warn him against throwing stones at witches, he had vanished into a side street.
Come over here, pretty,
a man leered.
Lift up your skirts, and I'll show you some real magic.
I don't have the time for such a little magic, Marianna muttered and hurried into the slums. Chapter 2. It took Marianna another 15 minutes to reach her goal. The brothel lay between the worst and second worst parts of town. Every road that ran north to the outer walls passed by the squat building, as though some power less benign than that which formed the world had ensured that no man should go on to happier paths without first being tempted. Many a foot did falter, and many a voyager turned from his intended path to avail himself of the beauties within. The girls who worked in the brothel were lovely to behold, but beneath the light and the loud music, there was darkness and sorrow to be found in their prettily furnished bedrooms. The accidents that often befell the prostitutes were half the reason Marianna came here. In some ways, the building could have been called rich. Though the windows were cracked and the walls were crumbling, it boasted indoor toilets, electricity and running water, and even a tiny scruffy patch of grass in the rear that the management had dotted with wooden tables and chairs for those drinkers desiring a little night air. Apart from the grass, the four walls contained 6 or 7 leafy trees. One of them, at least, was large enough to suit Marianna's purposes. Hurriedly, Marianna stripped down until she was wearing only her shift. She tucked her outer garments into a rucksack and slid the bag behind a rubbish bin. Then, hooking her toes into a dent in the wall, she braced her hands on the top and hoisted herself over, landing lightly on the other side. She looked around her, checking that she had not drawn any attention. No voices shouted, and nobody appeared at the door that led into the bar. Near the kitchen, a low window looked out upon the grass. From that window came the sound of a woman crying. Moments later, the cry became a groan and then a screech. The fear and determination balanced in that voice revealed that the sound was of a woman in labor. Marianna was familiar with the cry. In her mortal form, she was called, in secret and under the cover of night, to attend the most difficult births in the city. She had seen many a mother through her travail, and few were the babies that she delivered that had not lived through their first night, at least. Of course, when there were deaths, the blame was uniformly laid at her door. Luckily for Marianna, her family's history of power protected her. The people who wanted to come after her were afraid that they would be cursed. Or worse, if they organized a mob to hang or burn her. A good thing, too, or every dull, hot Saturday in summer might have seen her at risk of roasting. Marianna scanned the garden again, relieved to find it still empty. She was nearly naked, and her body, though not a perfect specimen of youth, was lean and brown enough to draw the desire of a man, especially one who had been imbibing. The people of the city might know not to mess with her on pain of death, but some men were stupid. Lustful and drunken men were even more foolish. Being accused of taking lives in secret was one matter, but if she was forced to tear out the throat of a lecher, she would have to leave the area. If that happened, she would no longer be able to help the people she watched over. Thinking of that, Marianna drew in a soothing breath. Slowly, she sent her senses running out over her body. feeling every bone, vein, tendon, and sinew. Whispering an incantation under her breath, Marianna began the change. Gasping as shivers and then prickles raced across her body. Briefly, the sensation became pain. Marianna bit her lip, holding back a cry. Then she felt her body shrink. Her arms became claws, and she winced as feathered wings exploded from her back. The change was over before the hurt had become full-blown agony, and Marianna settled onto a branch in the form of a glossy brown owl. Marianna had first changed when she was 7 years old, surprising herself almost as much as her parents. They had known it was possible. Her mother and grandmother had both been La Yakuza, women of power and might who were also, when needed, able to transform into owls. Marianna, however, had transformed much younger than any of her forebears, who had acquired the ability at puberty. Marianna had flapped out of a window before her mother could bar it, and her mother and grandmother had searched the country for hours before they had found her. They carried her back to the cottage, wrapping her in blankets and sitting her on her bed until she'd calmed enough to resume her human form. Her mother had given her bread and milk and tucked her up to sleep. It hadn't been until after they'd breakfasted the next day that Marianna's mother had explained what had happened to her and what it had meant. Most people believed that La Yakuza were all malevolent. They said that they drew children and lone travelers out of their way to capture or murder them, sometimes in revenge for things done to them in this or in former lives. Marianna's mother had told her that such things sometimes happened, but that, much like the owls whose form they took, La Yakuza could be either wicked or wise. At first, Marianna had only changed form at moments of high emotion. It had taken her 2 years to achieve the calm necessary to alter her form at will. In the meantime, Juana had taught her daughter about the properties of plants and the balance of powers on Earth. She had also introduced her to the Creator, the divine power served by every creature of goodwill. Marianna's ancestors had considered themselves to be part of that company. Soon, Marianna had decided to follow in their footsteps. As it turned out, the early beginning of Marianna's education had been provident because both her mother and grandmother had passed away by the time she turned 16. Marianna had done all she could to honor their memories, even when that had meant encountering trouble and danger. Tonight's errand was less bloody than others, but that did not mean it was without risk. With a bird's eyes, Marianna could see more than she had in human form. She stared through the low window at the scene within. The girl on the bed was barely 17. Her name was Annie. Marianna had known Annie since she was a child. The girl had a quick wit and a sharp mind. By all rights, she should have been tucked up in her own bedroom, doing homework and chatting with her best friend on the phone. Sadly, life wasn't kind in the city. Keeping body and soul together often required a terrible cost. Besides herself, Annie supported 4 sisters and an ailing grandmother. The baby that she was straining to birth was her third, and her chulo, the man who called himself her agent but who was, in truth, her pimp, was by no means pleased by her fertility. Marianna had taken the first child, but the chulo had been too quick with the second. The infant had been gone by the time that she'd reached the outside of the brothel. Marianna had found the body, a beautiful girl child, blue and lifeless but otherwise fully formed. Marks on her face suggested that she had been smothered. Marianna had taken the child and buried her just inside the far wall of the church, whispering a prayer of blessing over her resting place. Marianna was determined not to miss out this time. Taking a slow breath, she lifted from the tree and glided across the garden, landing on the windowsill. From the birthing room came the sense of blood and sweat. The other women had hung knotted red thread from the windows to protect the birthing place, but Annie had removed it long before her crisis came. As Marianna watched, Annie gave a strangled sob, and the child thumped down onto the bedspread, enlivening the night with his first living yell. In a way, The chulo's neglect served them well tonight. By leaving Annie to give birth alone, he had given Marianna the time that she needed. Annie, too, knew that time was of the essence. Not pausing, she tied off the umbilical cord, cut it with the sharp scissors she had prepared, and raised her son to her lips to give him a kiss of greeting. Then, without pausing to wipe the residue of birthing from his face, she wrapped the little one in swaddling clothes. Sobbing, with the umbilicus still falling down between her legs, Annie rose from the bed and approached Marianna. Annie was muttering in broken Spanish. It was the Magnificat, a prayer to the Virgin Mary beseeching her help and protection. Many said that the Magnificat would protect birthing mothers from Bruja. It was also supposed to drive back La Lechuza. Maybe it did when La Lechuza threatened the mother or child, but to Marianna, it was a siren song, a call to duty. Annie's pleading green eyes fixed upon Marianna's black ones, and she let out a hiccuping sob.
Take care of him.
Annie begged, one hand hovering over her newborn son.
Do not let him be found.
Marianna nodded her feathered head, spreading her wings. Annie placed the child into a wide, padded leather satchel. Placing the bag's strap into Marianna's claws, she bowed, paying no attention to the blood streaming down her legs. Marianna drew upon all of her strength and took wing. Chapter 3. Marianna landed about a mile away from her house in the spreading branches of an oak tree. From there, it was an easy hop to the ground. Blinking her owl eyes, Marianna focused on the spell that allowed her to doff her feathers. Instants later, she stood barefoot on the ground, once again a tall young woman with a tangle of rich chestnut hair. She withdrew a bundle of clothes from a hole in the tree's base and was soon dressed in a warm wool dress and cloak. Reaching up, she plucked the bag that held the baby from the tree and removed its precious contents, tucking him into her arms. The little one did not seem a bit perplexed by his strange journey. Indeed, such was his faith in the world's justice that the boy had dropped from his natal cries into a deep and steady sleep, not stirring even when she slipped him from the bag and wrapped him up in a shawl. Marianna watched him for a while. He was a handsome babe blessed at birth with a wealth of curling black hair. His features were well-defined and generous, and his chin bore a tiny cleft. A legacy, she was sure, from his absent father. She wondered if his eyes would remain deep blue or darken to emerald green like his mother's. There had been no time for Annie to tell Marianna what she wished to name her son, but Marianna thought she would call him Mateo. The name means gift from God. The boy was a gift despite his humble origins. For tonight, she would keep Mateo in her hut. She had a supply of milk laden purchased from a wet nurse who lived but 3 miles down the road. She would feed the lad, bathe him, and dress him in the fine clothes she had ready. Perhaps someone would hear Mateo's cries, but even if they did, they would not dare to approach her. Marianna knew very well what the locals thought of her and what they believed she did with the children she rescued. They said that she conjured, using the flesh of the babes to imbue greater power into her foul brews. The more imaginative said she sacrificed them to El Diablo, then broke her fast by devouring their meat. That was why the wives of the township felt justified in calling her El Monstru, the monster. There were times when their whispers brought laughter to Marianna's lips. Still, deep down, the hurt of each curse simmered. If the villagers had known her darkest secret, they would never have believed she would forsake an innocent life. Marianna shook her head, unwilling to focus for too long upon her own pain. She might never be able to shelter a child within her own body, but she could see to it that other children were allowed to live instead of being cast away like rubbish. Mateo needed a bath and a fire, and Marianna needed a cup of sweet wine to help ease the fierce aching in her bones. The child hiccuped. Looking down, Marianna saw that Mateo was awake. His head was tilted, and he was watching her interestedly out of wide, wise eyes. Perhaps it was just wind, but Marianna believed he smiled at her. Tomorrow, she would leave Matteo with a childless couple from 3 villages over. She knew the pair were loving and able to afford a child. Matteo would bring them joy, and they would give him love, and their lives would be happier into the bargain. For tonight, though, the monster would take her opportunity to be a mother. She would hold the child named Matteo in her arms, whisper a blessing for his future, and pray for the health of the brave girl who had given him birth. For tonight, the Bruja would be only a woman. The witch would be a mother. So, how did you enjoy meeting Marianna? I really liked that story. Of course, there is some sadness in it. The condition of the girls in the brothel, desperate to save their children before they were tossed away like rubbish, is utterly heartbreaking. It makes me so happy to know that Allah Lakuza, commonly reputed to be vile and wicked, is saving young lives in such a rare and unique manner. Come to think of it, it is strange that owls have 2 such disparate reputations, being wicked and cruel but also learned and wise. If owl shapeshifters do exist somewhere in the world, perhaps it makes sense that the evil ones would be balanced by a group that shares the owl's positive aspects, rather than its frightening ones. There may be a lesson in that. People may see the worst in us, but we should always strive to be and do the best that we possibly can. My reputation has fluctuated dramatically over the centuries. I have been called a witch more than once, but I am careful to keep my balance sheet fully in the black. Will that be enough when I finally meet my maker? I don't know. I will have to wait and see.